And we put it down the chute. And she came in very indignantly. She already had a title. That's her title. Joking. Ages and ages and ages and ages. My wife's been in the margins. And it's not really
Okay. Is this on? No? Yes? I'm not sure. Okay, is this on?
Yes.
Everybody here? Well, good evening and welcome all of you. There's a seat for everybody. There are a few empties at the front if there's anybody who is still standing or wants to move closer. I'm Roger Pasquier. I'm the chairman of our book jury, and I'd like to welcome all of you. And I thought the prize winners and everyone else might like to know a little bit about the process that led to these awards this year. Every year, there are about 250 books that are published about New York, fiction, nonfiction of all types. This year, there were 6 alone on baseball in New York. So we always look for books that give some kind of special insight into an aspect of New York life, past or present, and that will be enjoyed by library members. We are not restricted to any particular types of books. We're not obliged to give a fiction prize or a prize for poetry or any other topic, so we are completely free to choose the books that we think are the best in any category or no category. And the jury expertise helps us separate the authoritative and the original from the derivative and the error-filled. Every book is read by at least one juror, and as we narrow the field to the most promising, we seek to have each of those books read by every juror. And I want to thank especially all the members of the jury, Larry Bergreen, Lucien Bloch, Barbara Cohen, Jules Cohn, Joe Drape, John Hargraves, Bobby Lee, Betsy Rogers, Cynthia Saltzman, and Meg Wolitzer. Every one of the jurors is a published author. And now I'm going to read you a longer list of the topics on which we have published, but I will leave it to you to match the authors with their topics. So, New York history of various eras, the art market and collecting, New York politics, German literature, ornithology, conservation, urban planning, park history, several different sports, biography, the history of exploration from Marco Polo to Mars, corporate behavior, social science, museums and cultural trends, New York artists and art spaces, and fiction. There's one topic that comes up every year that we don't have an authority on, and none of us are that inclined to read. So if anybody here is involved with organized crime, please see me after. We can use you on the jury. And this year's winners, if you've looked at the program, testify to the diversity and the specialization of books that we review and have found outstanding. And we're very happy this year to have Adam Gopnik, who's over here, who's a library member, give us his view of how these books come together or what kind of synthesis or coherence you may have found in them. Mr. Gopnik has been a writer for The New Yorker since 1986, and I'm sure everybody who reads the New Yorker probably has at least one favorite article to cite by him. He's written a lot about Paris from his years there, and I will tell you that the article I always think about is one on the crisis of French cuisine, where you gave the most explicit explanation of the theoretical and practical differences between classic French and American cooking. And every time I'm in the kitchen doing a reduction to make a sauce, I think of you. So he's also written a lot about New York, and his most recent book, Angels and Ages, is about the impacts of Darwin and Lincoln on modern life. And in October, we look forward to his next book, which is called Steps Across the Water, which is set in New York and another city called U Nork. So there you are.
Actually, one of my favorite subjects is organized crime in New York. And actually, I've always thought that the coming together of the 5 families here to give order and reason and meaning to what had previously been anarchic crime in the city is one of our great social achievements. Only recently, and in all seriousness, it occurs to me that there was a terrific book by a young prosecutor in New York just last year about why it was that organized crime, the compact of the 5 families, had broken down. And he explained quite brilliantly that what had destroyed organized crime was not Rudy Giuliani and certainly not any of the federal prosecutors, of which team he had been one, but was instead the sexual revolution, the credit card, and the New York State Lottery, because the sexual revolution ended the profits you could make in prostitution, the New York State Lottery ended the numbers game, and the credit card essentially ended the loan sharking business, or rather took it over and made it even more. And then, therefore, the theme I wanted to strike today is struck already, and that is that change happens quickly and mysteriously and very powerfully in New York. Something that seems as fixed in place and as permanent a part of the civic landscape as the mafia itself can diminish and vanish over time. New York is a city of vanishings. When I think about the New York I knew 30 years ago, when I first came here with my wife to the city, and we lived in the smallest apartment in the city on 87th and 1st Avenue, and it truly was. It was a 1 9-by-11 room. People used to invite people over for dinner, and they would have that wide-eyed look. The 86th Street that we knew then of German restaurants and Austrian restaurants, the ideal restaurant, which was like a George Gross drawing of a restaurant where pasty-faced families filed in at 5:30 to have supper, all vanished, all absolutely gone now, gone beyond imagining. One of the appeals, I think, of Paris to so many Americans is that it is just the opposite city. It's a city of continuities, often very attenuated continuities, often of excessive continuities, often of continuities that have turned into a kind of trap and a limitation, a pen for Parisians. But nonetheless, New York is that city of fundamental and constant change. And in reaction to that change, in response to the knowledge of that change, we build certain kinds of insulation. One kind of insulation we build is what I always think of as a lightness of heart and a lightness of foot that many veteran New Yorkers have to a greater degree than any other people. I think often of my good friend and inspired senior writer at the New Yorker, now gone last, Philip Hamburger. I don't know if many of you knew Phil and Anna. They were, to my mind, the model New Yorkers of their or any other generation. What made Phil Hamburger a great writer about New York, and no one ever wrote better about New York than Phil Hamburger did, was that he was always limitlessly excited by the next thing coming, whatever it was. He always believed that the new thing, the thing that was arriving, was the most exciting thing there was. I remember how excited he was by the arrival of video stores. Video rental stores. That was so amazing that all of these movies now were available. You could have them anytime. You could see them in the morning, see them at night. And now the reign of the video rental store is past, which seemed so acute then. So we make our New York partly out of that kind of embrace of change and that love of change. We have to, or we leave. But we also, I think, respond to the limitless vanishings, to the endless and relentless change in New York by building little safe houses, little safe rooms small places where we can feel some sense of continuity, and with that sense of continuity, some sense of safety. For me, there's no stronger room, there's no safer and more secure spot than this one, than the New York Society Library. There's no place where I feel a sure sense, not just of continuity, but of the excitement that comes with knowing that within that continuity is the possibility of discovery. I did all of my research for the last book, the Lincoln and Darwin book, Angels and Ages, essentially in these halls and in these rooms. And not only found all of the books that I needed, but I found them in a way, in a form, on open shelves in happy rooms that enabled me to feel that I wasn't engaged in the horrible graduate student drudge of research, but was instead engaged in the kind of authorial act of discovery. And often when I would come here, I would bring my daughter Olivia along, and Olivia would make herself at home in the children's room, she would turn off at the bar on the 3rd floor and go and read for the day. She's one of those natural reading kind of kids. You know, there's one in every family where the house is very quiet and you know that the child is reading. With our other child, you know that he's on his computer. That one house is very quiet and he's playing three-dimensional tic-tac-toe with somebody in Malaysia as you're talking. And that idea that we build in New York out of safe places, out of small rooms, out of small parts of safety, is one that comes up in my forthcoming book, which is called The Steps Across the Water. And I thought if you'd indulge me in lieu of making a real speech, I would read you a little something from it, just a very short piece, because I tried to illustrate and exemplify that idea in the action of this children's story. I should explain that it takes place right here in New York. It begins in Central Park on the Great Lawn, when a little girl named Rose, who's the younger daughter of a family who had been transplanted from Paris to New York, suddenly sees an astonishing crystal staircase arc out across the pond, the turtle pond in Central Park, and then disappear again. Well, you're all grown up, so I can tell you a little bit about what happens in the story, but you can't tell anyone. And that is, she follows those stairs to another city called U Nork. This all began, I should add, because Olivia, my daughter, would always say when she was smaller, she'd spoonerize words. And when people would ask her where she came from, she'd say, I come from U Nork City. She would say very proudly, and people would laugh. And she would feel badly, and then and she would struggle not to say it, but she couldn't help herself. And so we began to tell stories about New York, and I said, you know, it's okay, you tell people you come from New York. New York is a much better city than you. It's much bigger, and it's much busier, and it's, you know, all of these people who come from New York are really bridge and tunnel people, and they're waiting to get to New York someday. So out of our tales of New York came this book, because Rose, the little girl in the book, ends up in New York, which is a much bigger city. But she's baffled by everything she sees in New York, and when she comes back, she decides to console the wisest New Yorker she knows, who's the oldest living writer at the magazine where her father works as a cartoonist. Her father makes cartoons only of one subject, to castaways on a desert island, and has been writing new captions for the same cartoon for 25 years. He's a true drudge for a weekly comic magazine. I don't know who he's based on. The writer she goes for comfort to is named Joe Murphy. And he's been at the magazine almost forever. And it comes from the South. And he has a soft accent. And she's been given the world's tiniest dog while she was in New York. And she desperately needs somebody to help her begin to understand it. And she goes to her father's office and persuades Mr. Murphy to come to lunch with her at the Oyster Bar in Grand Central. They walk there. And when they're there, this is what happens. And they talk a bit about New York. Rose had been once to the Oyster Bar with her father, and she had liked it. It was a long, low cellar room covered with weaving tiles and a long counter snaking through it. There were tables with red checkered tablecloths, but everyone who knew what's what sat at the counter, which was where Rose and Mr. Murphy now sat too. Rose liked underground rooms and low ceilings. She must have been a lizard or something in an earlier life, she thought to herself. They ordered the oyster pan roast that Mr. Murphy had promised. As they ate the spicy, rich stews, Rose didn't actually eat the oysters, which she found too hard to chew, but she liked all the surrounding bits. She tried to find the right way to tell Mr. Murphy about U Nork, but it seemed too awkward, and anyway, not really believable. He seemed relaxed, though, and she was glad to see that he wasn't one of those old people who sort of slurped his food and showed his teeth and gums while he did. He could talk and eat at the same time without being sloppy, and Rose wished there were more old people like that. The thing about this city, he was saying, the thing about this city is that it's full of hiding places. And why does it feel so right to be in an oyster bar, Rose? Because we're all oysters here, living in our shells. You're an oyster, I'm an oyster, all clammed up inside our shells, working on our pearls. Mr. Murphy's been working on the same book for 50 years. Why, I knew someone who lived right here in the terminal, stowed away in a little apartment he found up hidden in the ceiling. Other people, they live down below in the tunnels. Why, even a man living in a one-room studio has more of a universe to himself here in New York than anyone put in Murgatroyd, North Carolina. In small towns, you never have your own world, no matter how much space you have. In New York, there's a world in every room. Here in New York, it's secret upon secret upon secret. World upon world upon world. Why no, a universe, a galaxy, anything you like at all, in a tiny space. He smiled. Mr. Murphy, Rose said once she thought of a way to raise the issue on her mind without giving away the truth. Mr. Murphy, what little room would you go to if you needed information on something a bit weird, kind of weird? Like, you know, intergalactic travel of entire civilizations from one planet to the next. And the care and feeding of super tiny dogs. He didn't even stir from his panos when she said it, just stirred it. Intergalactic travel? Care of hyper-miniaturized dogs? Well, for out-of-the-way information and good old books that have it, the only place to go is the Medusa bookstore and ask the Cone sisters. And off they go to the Medusa bookstores. I will give away that the Medusa bookstore is actually the Argosy bookstore under another name. And they find out everything they need to know. But I could have substituted the Society Library for the Medusa bookstore in that sense. Because that's what New York gives you. It gives you change, it gives you vanishing, and then it gives you the beautiful division into small parts and a few nodes where infinite knowledge is available. Thinking about the books that are being celebrated tonight, I think you can see that each of these books in some way takes the vanishing of New York, takes the way New York comes apart as its subject, and then memorializes, makes a little room of its own out of memory. Boulevard of Dreams, a wonderful book about the transformation of the Bronx, a book that combines nostalgia for a lost place with cool analysis of why it was found and why it was lost afterwards. Mapping New York, a book that shows us how many ways there are to see this city, how many ways you can divvy up over time and how many ways you can represent it. Mitzvah Girls, a terrific book that tells us about the struggles and the trials and joys of being a Hasidic girl in Brooklyn at this moment. And The Row House Reborn, which is a study of an architectural typology, I think that's the technical term for it, that one might not even have been aware of as a peculiar and particular New York housing type. And finally, the Hudson Fulton Celebration, which is a terrific study of a particular moment in 1909, if I remember correctly, when this city had a new awareness of itself as a place with a history. Each one of these books takes something that to some degree is inaccessible to us, either inaccessible because it's part of a lost past, or inaccessible because it's part of another tribe, another civilization that may be going on right across the Williamsburg Bridge. But each of it shows us in a way that we can articulate and that we can understand, each of these books, how New York, despite its limitless variety, for all of its endless disappearance, how pearls are made within the oyster shell of New York. And there could be no brighter pearls than these books. Let me first give an award in spirit to the two authors who couldn't be here with us tonight. Andrew Scott Dalcart wins the award for architecture for The Row House Reborn, Architecture in Neighborhoods in New York City, 1908 to 1929. He would have loved to have been here with us tonight, but unfortunately he is stuck on a tarmac in Jordan. Not Jordan, Mississippi, but Jordan like the country. I don't think that the volcano reached out all the way across there. I think this is more a kind of intra-Middle Eastern problem. But in any case, he very courteously wrote to say, "I am so appreciative because this book means so much to me. It was meant to introduce New Yorkers to a new kind of architecture, one that was known well in the teens and 20s, but is much less known today. I hope it can be newly appreciated and therefore preserved. Thank you." And we thank him for this wonderful book. The award for visual history goes to Mapping New York, which was edited by Phoebe Adler, Tom Howells, and Duncan McCorkadale, and published by Black Dog Press. And fascinatingly, they are all British, and they are all still safely ensconced in that much too large, secure room of London. I find it endlessly interesting that this book, which studies all of the generations and possibilities for Mapping New York, would be done in England. It's a sign, I think, of how much the idea of New York, the image of New York, reaches out beyond our city borders. I actually once knew and wrote a story about someone in London who had been building a scale model of New York. You can find it on the New Yorker website. Building a scale model of New York for his entire life, sort of like the one out in Queens, but more idiosyncratic and folk artish, and had never been to New York at all in his life. New York existed for him, as it exists for so many of us, as an ideal place. And now, the awards to those who were not stuck on the ground or imprisoned by the British election, and offered with great pleasure. The award for social history goes to Constance Rosenblum for Boulevard of Dreams, Heady Times, Heartbreak, and Hope along the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Constance? Have a word. This is like the Oscars. Meg is going to start playing her accordion. Cut you short.
When I went to my daughter's graduation a couple of years ago, Robert Redford got an honorary degree, but they had not told him that he would have to speak, because I think if he would have had to speak, he wouldn't have taken the degree. So he stood up and he made a few comments about the environment, and he looked gorgeous, and he wasn't very verbal, I have to say. And so I don't know what I will say, but I do have to say I'm hugely honored to have won this award. I love the library. I've done a lot of research here. I'm ashamed to say I've sometimes snuck up to this room when my membership had lapsed, and tiptoe up and work here and then tiptoe out again. I mean, not very often. But I really, the librarians were great, and I love the stacks, and it means a huge amount to me to be getting an award for a place that honors New York books, and it really, I can't say how much, but anyhow, I'm very honored to be here, and thank you again.
The next book we're honoring, I have an immediate liking for it, even before I opened it, because I love the name of its author. In our family, we have an Isla in our family. We call her Isla. Is it Ayala, or do you use Isla? You pronounce it correctly then. Right. It's the title, as I'm sure you know, of one of Trollope's best and least known novels, Isla's Angel, and a book we love. And this is a really wonderful book called written by Isla Fader or Fader. Isla Fader, Myths for Girls, Bringing Up the Next Generation of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. There's nothing harder for any writer or reporter or researcher or scholar to do than to enter a world which is designed to be, to some degree, closed, designed to be, in some degree, unwelcoming to outsiders. To enter that world with sympathy and at the same time with skeptical distance is one of the remarkable achievements that any reporter can make, that any scholar can achieve. And that's what this book achieves. Would you please welcome the award for cultural anthropology.
I want to thank you so much to the Society Library for this New York City Book Award. I'm really honored to be here with you all. I'll just say a few words, but as a New Yorker and a Jewish woman and not least a cultural anthropologist, so no stranger to guilt, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the process of writing Mitzvah Girls, which is an ethnography about how Hasidic women living in the heart of Borough Park, Brooklyn, teach their daughters to want to become the next generation of believers. I was raised as a Reform Jew on Manhattan's Upper West Side, and curiosity and a sense of nostalgia for what I imagined was the lost world of my great-grandparents had always made me wonder about the lives of Hasidic women and girls, living so close in the city but so differently. When I began the project as a graduate student in anthropology, it was becoming increasingly acceptable to do ethnographic research in the US, even in my own city, New York, with women and girls with whom I shared a common history. Getting access to Hasidic women and girls was a challenge, for despite being cosmopolitan New Yorkers, Hasidic Jews live, as Adam said, in close communities. It was my own identity as a Jewish New Yorker that was key, as was my potential for becoming what many women expected that I already was, a Balas Tshuva, a BT, a returning to the faith. I was honest about doing my research for my doctorate and then a book, but many of the women I met just shook their heads and said, Ayla, why do you think God led you to this topic? I think that my efforts to get into the community, dressing modestly in long skirts and blouses and a hat, learning Yiddish, and even following the same life cycle events as the women I was meeting, getting married, having children, was ambiguous for them and at times for me too, blurring the distinction between observer and observed. My own assumptions as a Jewish feminist created ongoing tensions and some unexpected findings. For example, I had assumed that Hasidic women and girls would be passive, frumpy, out of step with the times, given the centrality of male authority and the laws of modesty. So I was initially surprised, for example, when women all had cell phones way before I did, when women aggressively pushed to the front of lines, when they looked stunning at holidays, or made references to popular culture. I have come to understand Hasidic Judaism as part of the unexpected rise of what some people call fundamentalist movements worldwide, but which I prefer to call instead non-liberal religious movements, which include, for example, evangelical Christians here in the US or Islamists in Egypt. When Hasidic Jews arrived in New York City after the Holocaust, they defied all predictions of assimilation and flourished, in part because of the increasing tolerance for public displays of religion and ethnicity in the US. Unexpectedly, this generation of Hasidic women and girls has become more religiously stringent than their parents, but in ways that can seem paradoxical or contradictory, by becoming increasingly fluent in secular modernity. Women and girls' role in this community is to keep out the secular city for men, who are the only ones who are allowed to study the sacred Torah. But the way they protect men and boys is not by building a wall to the city. Instead, they actually filter, sample, redeem, and even enjoy the secular cultural life of the city, all the while fulfilling their religious obligations as Hasidic women, something which challenges our assumptions that Hasidic women are oppressed. The range of responses to Mitzvah Girls since its publication has required me to confront the implications of my work, since the people in the community and elsewhere have been actually reading it. I followed a thread, for example, about my book written by ultra-Orthodox women, going back and forth as to whether I got things right or not, and if yes, claiming I must be an insider who left, which I am explicitly not. I received an email from an Orthodox woman telling me she was horrified to read Mitzvah Girls, and hope no Gentiles read it. And the very same day, an email from a Hasidic woman in Williamsburg who told me it was strange but intriguing to read about her own life in an anthropology book. The Hasidic women I write about, some of whom have remained dear friends, have many political and religious convictions which are deeply problematic for my personal beliefs and for my professional ones too. Since we share the social space of New York City, there's the issue of contested citizenship. I have a different understanding of community and civic responsibility than the women I worked with. At times, my position as an anthropologist requires a different stance than my position as a New Yorker. I continue to wonder what happens when loyalties and responsibilities to Jews and the nation state or to Jews and academia conflict. Can and should we have tolerance for non-liberal religious groups who are defined in part by their rejection of tolerance itself as a self-evident value? I can only hope that Mitzvah Girls raises for my readers, as it has for me, broad humanistic issues which beg for complex political engagements in New York City and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Isla, for those really eloquent remarks. And I think that all of us who write about New York City, whether as full-fledged academics or mere journalists, have that sense often of being anthropologists in the city, trying to enter into other worlds, and it's what that book does so beautifully. I recall my own encounter with Hasidism at the knife's edge when my son was born 15 years ago at Mount Sinai Hospital, and every other baby born that night in the ward was a Lubavitcher. And every single newborn infant, hour, 2 hours old, had a little picture of the Reb Schneerson in the little cradle. So the first thing that they would see when their eyes opened was the face, the beaming, bearded face of the Reb. And my son was the only one who didn't have a picture in his thing, and I thought, whose picture should I put in there? I thought maybe I put Red Auerbach or Sam Pollock or some great Jewish general manager of a sports team. And I tried to make friends, but I thought, I'm a Jew of a sort, of a kind, and went up to one of the Lubavitcher fathers, who looked very old when you first see them, and then incredibly young when you look at them again. And I said, that's my son in there. And he said, oh, what's his name? And I said, his name is Luke Auden. And he kind of backed away from me with a celerity I'll always remember. Thank you, Isla, for your book and for your words. The last book we have to celebrate is one that reaches back further in time, that reminds us of a moment, of a kind of hinge moment in the city's history. A hinge moment between the 19th century and the 20th century, but even more between the New York that was being born in the 19th century and the larger, more complicated, in some ways darker New York of the 20th. It's called the Hudson Fulton Celebration, New York's River Festival of 1909, and the Making of a Metropolis. And it brings together elements of social anthropology of a kind, of geography, into our understanding of the city. The award for history, New York Society Library, this year goes to Kathleen Egan Johnson for the Hudson Fulton Celebration.
Thank you. This is indeed an honor, and I want to thank the New York Society Library for this award. It means so much to receive it here, particularly in the presence of this august group. And I can't help feeling as if Washington Irving, one of New York's secular saints, is with us in spirit this evening. As curator of Historic Hudson Valley, I help preserve and interpret his beloved home, Sunnyside, in Tarrytown. Irving was also a trustee and a member of the Society Library. And I would like to think that he would approve of the Hudson Fulton Celebration book. Irving, the young upstart, caused great mischief when he authored Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of New York 200 years ago in 1809. Part actual history and part lampoon, his book mocked New York's 17th century founding fathers. And while I haven't really written a comic satire, I have tried to shoot some humor through this cultural study. And, like Irving, I've poked at a nearly forgotten aspect of New York history to see what comes flying out. The thesis of the book is straightforward. On the surface, civic leaders created the 1909 celebration to honor the historical figures of Henry Hudson and Robert Fulton. But if we dig a little deeper, we see that they really used this street and river festival to assert that New York rated as a world-class, imperial, and very modern city. Hard to believe, but at the start of the 20th century, New York's unrivaled status was not yet assured. When sculpting the book, I wanted to offer something for everyone. So it's my fervent wish that those interested in urban studies and the history of technology will appreciate how crowds of record size and boldly beautiful nighttime illuminations tested the city's infrastructure. Those intrigued by political and social history can learn how and why progressive Republicans used theme parades and children's pageants to win the hearts and minds of recent immigrants and youth. Environmentalists will see how the designation of the Southern Palisades and other parks during the celebration reflected contemporary ideas about the wise use of natural resources and of scenic protection. Hopefully those interested in the history of transportation will enjoy the variety of participating vessels, from replicas of the Half Moon and the Clermont to biplanes and dirigibles and the most advanced battleships of the day. Art and antiques devotees will witness how museums strengthen themselves through groundbreaking exhibitions. At the Metropolitan Museum, this included a show that inspired the creation of the American Wing. Those who relish graphic design, collectibles, and old-time photographs of the city should have plenty of illustrations to pore over. And for science fiction fans, the final chapter highlights the celebration's futuristic flavor and its imaginings about what New York City life would be like in the distant year of 2009. I especially want to recognize the book's wonderful designer, Stephen Schoenfelder, my very talented editor, Margaret Vitter, Waddell Stillman, the president of Historic Hudson Valley, who firmly supported the book, and my husband and photographer, Greg Johnson. Thanks too to Katie Sweeney and the other good people at Fordham University Press. And I'm also grateful to the book's funders, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Howard Milstein and the Immigrant Savings Bank, furthermore, a program of the J.M. Kaplan Fund and the Hudson River Improvement Fund. Thank you.
I should add only to those wonderful remarks that I've always admired Washington Irving because he wrote a story about a New Yorker who got a really good sleep, and he knew that that story was a fantasy. Let me close by saying something that I can say as a member of this library rather than as an official of it, and that is that libraries are in complicated circumstances these days all around the world. What's a library for that's full of books in an age when you can press on Google and find so many things? What a library is for is to be a library. It's not just a place to discover knowledge, it's a place to make knowledge, a place to think, a place to write in ways that can only be done in those small, secluded, and special rooms that are refuges for all of us in New York. If you haven't renewed your membership, renew it. If you haven't made a contribution to the library, make one now. And above all, renew your allegiance to this wonderful institution and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Mark Bartlett, the head librarian. It's so wonderful to have a standing room only crowd here tonight. This is our 15th year, and we will be back for a 16th year next year. I'd like to thank Adam for his wonderful remarks and hosting tonight. The jury, many of the members are here this evening. And let's do a big round of applause for the winners once again. Now, if you go away and you forget about the past awards and all of that, just go to our website. We actually do archive all the past winners, and it's very easy to find on our website or with a quick Google search for New York City Book Awards. And the authors who are here this evening will be more than happy to sign copies of the books, which we have for sale. And please stay for some more food and drink. Thanks for coming.